And more than enough for a quorum, so with that inducement, I'm going to call this meeting of the full committee to order. And I hope this one isolated time I actually have my cell phone off, and maybe ask y'all to try to do the same thing. We have, believe it or not, this late in the game, 5 first readers today. And I'm just going to take them in the order that I have on my sheet. For those of you that have not been here or had a first reader of this committee, the purpose of that is to let the entire committee know just generally what's in the bill, why you think it's a good idea, so the committee will know as it moves through our subcommittee process what's in the breadth of the committee. Do any member of the committee have anything to offer before we get into our first readers? Well, please accept my gratitude for being here, especially early in the day like this. And the chair would recognize my good friend from Macon, Representative Lucas. If you would, you can either come here or sit there, whichever your preference is. And we'd like to hear about your House Bill 1285, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen of the committee. House Bill 1285 and 1286 are identically the same, except for one is for the county and one is for the city. And this follows 993 that this committee passed out, which is sitting in rules. And this is local legislation that would designate the monies, if 993 is passed, to the Music Hall of Fame and the Sports Hall of Fame. And this is the local act that has to follow 993. I answer any questions, Mr. Chair.
This 993 now had to do with the hotel motel
Right.
tax and the designation of the 7th penny.
Right.
And it's an effort by you and your local delegation there to desperately continue to fund those wonderful tourist attractions.
Right.
I think it's split up amongst 3 things: the Sports Hall of Fame, the
Music
Hall of Fame,
and the Douglas Theater.
and the Douglas Theater, all of which are just signature tourist attractions right there in Middle Georgia. Does anyone have any questions for the presenter? We are on House Bill 1285, which we will assign to our Public Finance and Policy Subcommittee, and I hope that you can get a hearing on those bills very soon, probably next week. You want to go ahead while you're there. Is there anything different about 1286? I mean, that's
Both of them are the same. One is just for the city, and the other one is for the county, because we have a hotel motel tax that's levied in the city as well as the county.
okay. This is our document, right? Because it's not Macon County. Okay. I don't see any questions on that. That will likewise be assigned to the Public Finance and Policy Subcommittee. We look forward to moving those propositions on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
B. Smith. Is that Bob Smith? Is Representative Bob Smith here? Okay. He's got, Representative Bob Smith has House Bill 1332, members of the committee, which has to do with ad valorem tax, certification of assessed taxable property value, and changing some provisions. I can only wait with fond excitement as to what that might say, but we're going to go ahead and assign that to the ad valorem tax subcommittee. Representative Cassis has House Bill 1339, impact on revenues or expenditures of school system require fiscal notes, and we're going to assign that to the Public Finance and Policy since he was unable to be here. The last first reader, but certainly not the least, is one of our own, and if you want to present from your place, Representative Blanton, tell us about your House Bill 1288, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 1288 is a hotel motel tax for the city of Jonesboro, and basically, as with most of these motel taxes is just an opportunity for the local governments to try to look within to create a revenue stream in light of the financial difficulties that we're having now across the United States of America, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any questions for the gentleman? Chairman Rice.
My good friend from Clayton, I just wanted to see if I understood this right. Line 9 says it's an 8% rate not to exceed 8%. Is that, am I reading that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay. Is that not a fairly high percentage for?
Well, I believe we're already at 7%. Is why that's there. I'm not actually on the bill. Let me.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I believe that we're already at 7%, and that would be a 1% increase, which not beyond that 1% increase is basically what that's saying. Let me see here.
Other questions? Would the gentleman continue to yield?
Yes,
23. Is that Chairman Williams?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Glanton, will this depend on the passage of 993, same as Representative Lucas has, or is it this a standalone?
No, this has absolutely nothing to do with 993. This is specifically for the city of Jonesboro.
Okay.
Representative Glanton, do you have a resolution from the city setting out how they're going to use the funds?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman. I do have a resolution that was presented and signed by every council member and the mayor spelling out exactly what they're going to do with it.
Wonderful. Would you mind providing a copy of that when we get into the subcommittee meetings for the members?
Absolutely, Mr.
Okay.
Chair.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. We're going to assign that, Representative Glanton, to our Public Finance and Policy Subcommittee, and we look forward to move that on for you. That concludes our first readers for this morning, unless Representative Smith or Representative Cassis may have come in and I didn't see them. So we're going to move now, committee, over to our second readers, and these are matters that are up for consideration by the committee today. And I'm especially delighted to be able to recognize a great friend of Georgia and one of our chairmen and also subcommittee chairs to present his House Bill 1139, Chairman Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it okay if I remain here?
Wherever you'd like, sir. Thank
you. House Bill 1139 is a bill that passed out of subcommittee. This bill comes as a result of homeowners not receiving assessed value notifications in the mail during years in which property values were deemed to have remained the same. And in those situations, homeowners did not understand that they needed to appeal their property value because they had never received the notice. The subcommittee helped me perfect this bill to simply say that rather than making counties send out assessed values, right now if county does not change the value in property, state law says that the county does not have to send you an assessed notice if it remains the same. My personal opinion is I don't like that. I think every property owner ought to know what their property is being assessed at. And so rather than put an added cost on the county, what the subcommittee we wound up passing out was to say that we simply would add a checkbox on the existing property tax bill, which is when a homeowner is more aware of his property taxes than at any other time when he gets his property tax bill. And it would simply say that if you wish to appeal your next year's property tax, then you can check that box, and you may also write what you estimate your home value to be, and that will serve as a return and a request of appeal and start the process for the homeowner. And Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd submit to you then that allows every member to not have their right to appeal slip by unnoticed. And in essence, that's what the bill does.
Would the gentleman yield any questions?
I'd be glad to.
Any members wish to? certainly think it was well explained, and it's terrific legislation. No questions. We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on House Bill 1139? Is that right? And,
That's correct.
I'll make sure everybody's on the same page. LC 210765S. Is that what everybody has? Is that what you're?
Substitute to House. That's
Substitute.
correct. That's correct.
So it's actually, is it it's substitute?
It's actually
House
substitute
Bill
to
1139. Okay. We have a motion and a second. Do pass on substitute to House Bill 1139. Seeing no further discussion, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Thank you, Chairman Mills. We'll try to have this in rules instantly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members.
It's my honor to represent the majority whip. To recognize the majority whip. Representative Lindsay, you can go there or to the table. You have House Resolution 1 and House Bill 517 associated therewith. You can present those in tandem or individually as you choose.
Well, Mr. Chairman, why don't I sort of present them in tandem, and then at your pleasure, I'll be happy to sort of take up any questions on them one at a time, but they do sort of fit close together. I know for everyone here, this is to a certain degree Groundhog Day when it comes to this bill, but this is an important measure that this committee has worked very hard on, and I want to thank all the members of the committee, in particular the subcommittee, that have worked on this, as well as the various members of the General Assembly and the general public that have come to me over the past 2 years as we've tried to work on trying to come up with a balanced approach to deal with property tax reassessments in terms of what is the fairest method for dealing with those reassessments. And well, overall, sort of the overarching philosophy I think that you have in H.R. 1 is that in balance, we believe that folks ought to be reassessed and assessed based on investment in the property rather than on unrealized gains. And with that in mind, we have tried to craft a good bill here in terms of trying to deal with that issue. There are some, I will say, Mr. Chairman, that disagree with that, and we have heard from time to time various individuals, in particular local officials, who have questioned the fairness as to whether or not this is truly the fairest possible method for dealing with assessments in their particular areas. And my response to that is simple. I think it is not for those of us who govern to determine what is the fairest method of taxation, but for those who pay the taxes. And that's what we're going to allow here, is for folks who actually pay the taxes to decide in their particular counties whether or not they believe that a cap on reassessments is the fairest possible method for judging what is the value of the property that should be taxed. With that in mind, Mr. Chairman, let me sort of walk briefly through. I know this committee has heard this bill before, but I sort of want to walk through it very quickly. In particular, take up those areas where we have worked to make sure that this is a method that works in the particular counties around the state. The heart and soul of this provision comes at page 6 of H.R. 1, which basically begins sort of laying out the fact that this reassessment cap will be capped at no more than 3% of the rate of inflation per year. Since as a matter of general rule in this state, you're supposed to be reassessed at least once every 3 years, we allow for a 9% reassessment cap over a 3-year period of time. What we have added to this bill since the last time the full committee has seen it is a provision that in effect sets up a 2-step process. The first step, Mr. Chairman, is to authorize reassessment caps to be placed in the various counties around the state of Georgia. And that would go on the constitutional, on the ballot for approval by the voters in 2010. The second step, Mr. Chairman, would be to then allow in 2012, unless by local legislation the General Assembly in a particular county wishes to do so sooner, but no later than 2012 at the general election, will allow for a vote in the counties around the state to determine if in their particular counties they wish to have this reassessment cap be put into place. It would only go into place in those counties which affirmatively vote in favor of the reassessment cap. The bill, rather the constitutional amendment, further sets up provisions to allow by local, should it fail in a particular county in 2012, sets up procedures whereby it can be placed on the ballot on future dates by either local legislation or by the county commission at their discretion. It doesn't compel them to do so, it just simply allows for it to be done. That, in effect, Mr. Chairman, is H.R. 1. Although, however, there is one other, I think, extremely important aspect to this provision, which is, for the first time, it will recognize the constitutionality of existing homestead property tax reassessment freezes. There has been great concern around the state that the reassessment homestead freezes that we've put into place may be considered unconstitutional, and there may be some attacks on them for that reason. And we have, for that reason, Mr. Chairman, put into the Constitution for the first time recognizing the constitutionality of those provisions, both as to any county which in the future wishes to put them into place, and also recognizing their constitutionality in any counties or local governments that have already put it into place. And I think that's a very important protection for homeowners around the state of Georgia. In regards to HB 517, Mr. Chairman, this is basically the enabling legislation that accompanies H.R. 1. Obviously, it does not go into effect unless H.R. 1 is passed by the General Assembly by 2/3 margin and then approved by the voters. What 48.5C1 simply does, Mr. Chairman, sort of walking through it very briefly, is recognize the reassessment caps that are set forth in the Constitution. 48.5C4 will then sort of set out what will constitute a triggering for the purpose of reassessments. First are transfers in the property and different kinds of transfers in the property that will be recognized. That's generally 1 through 8, as set forth from line 57 through line 77. Line 78 recognizes that when it comes to non-homestead property, it can be difficult to assess when transfers take place, and so that we do allow an automatic trigger every 10 years for non-homestead properties to be reassessed. We then go down to C, Section C, Mr. Chairman, sort of sets forth those generally recognized kinds of activities that would not constitute a transfer of the property and not constitute a trigger. 48.5C5 basically allows for, doesn't require auditing on each piece of property by county assessors, and but does allow for them to audit in terms of obtaining information regarding possible transfers in property. Gives them the authority to do so. 48.5C6 basically sets forth a phase-in period where there is a triggered reassessment in the value of the property. It allows for a 7-year phase-in for that to basically minimize the concerns of both some folks in the home and the business community and homeowners in terms of what I call the sort of the howdy new neighbor concerns. It sort of allows for a phased in rather than a gradual step up rather than a sudden jump up in terms of reassessments. 48.5C7 simply recognizes that there are certain kinds of property that have certain other kinds of protections in terms of how they're dealt with, and simply recognizes that those will not that the law will not apply to them, since there are other provisions of the Constitution that deal with them. 48.5C20 on page 6, I think, is an important provision as well. We already have in the Constitution the right of certain school boards to lift off any kind of millage cap any kind of millage caps, and we also recognize in certain local charters that certain millage caps exist, but we don't have a procedure to clearly let local governments know how to do so in terms of if they wish to lift those millage caps. This simply, for the first time, Mr. Chairman, will lay out how either a school board or any kind of local government that has a millage cap and wishes to lift that millage cap off, how they can go about doing so. That, in essence, Mr. Chairman, is the bill and proposed constitutional amendment.
Will the gentleman yield any questions?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me. Number 1, Representative Abrams.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Lindsay.
Sure.
Can you discuss briefly how the long-term effect of this? My concern with H.R. 1 and with property cap assessments has always been that what it does is it shifts the burden of taxation to slower appreciating properties, because the only way to equalize revenue is to raise the millage rate. But if you're in a slower appreciating property, you're going to have a much higher effect, because the millage rate has to be uniform across the board. And in other states that have tried this, almost every study has demonstrated that the effect is more deleterious on those slower appreciating properties. Is there a mechanism included in this legislation that will arrest that effect for Georgians?
I think that what you see, well, first off, let me simply just sort of go into the fairness aspect. I think that what this bill, once again, gets back to my sort of fundamental principle here. Two things: that folks ought to be assessed based on their investment in the property rather than an unrealized gain. And that's what we're doing now, is basically taxing folks on an unrealized gain. And secondly, there's always going to be sort of a balancing in equities when it comes to what is the fairest possible method of taxation. And I'll say this, even though I support certain provisions that call itself the fair tax, there is no such thing as a fair tax. There are fairer and less fair methods of taxation, but there isn't anything ultimately fair. There's always a certain balance of equities. And what we're trying to do here, we think the fairest possible method is, in dealing with this, is in terms of focusing on one's investment in the property. And whether or not that is indeed the fairest method, whether or not someone in a area that does not grow as fast as other areas may or may not be hurt by this bill, I'm not so sure if I agree with your conclusions. But really, that's sort of, in my mind, for the folks who pay the taxes to consider. And that's why it needs to be placed on the ballot. I'll say this, that in every area of this state that has put certain kinds of restrictions on assessments, whether it be freezes or otherwise, in other parts of the country which have had referendums regarding this, that the taxpayers and the voters around the state, around the country, view this as the much more fair method of taxation.
One other question. The part of my concern also lies in the fact that in 1982, Georgia held a constitutional, we reformed our constitution to do away with exactly what we're trying to put back in place, that for almost 100 years we had non-uniform taxation in Georgia, so depending on the county you lived in, you could be taxed differently. And Georgia decided to adopt a uniform taxation. We grandfathered in one county that was out of conformance because they had a local constitutional amendment, and that was Columbus-Muskogee. And that county has been subject to several lawsuits because of the very point I made earlier about the deleterious effect on those lower growth properties. Fundamentally, my concern is why we would rescind something that we put into our Constitution, because 100 years ago we had exactly this very problem of non-uniform taxation. Can you...
If I may, basically, there is a reason why we put these things on paper and we don't chisel them into stone. It's because we are having the ability from time to time to come back and determine whether or not what we did in the past is truly the smartest and wisest way to deal with our local citizens, particularly in the area of taxation. That's what this committee does all the time.
Mr. Lindsay, if I can complete my question, actually, that wasn't my question.
Well, I apologize then. I thought that was your question.
That was not my question. My question then is, given that history,
Yeah.
do you have any data that demonstrates how we are going to fix the problems that we confronted in 1982 that I mean, essentially what we did in 1982 was try to fix the problem that was created for almost a century of non-uniform taxation. Do you have any data to demonstrate that this process will solve those problems that were identified in 1982?
I think the best data that can be seen is that in those areas where it's been put into place, it's never been repealed by the voters. And that, to me, speaks volumes in terms of whether or not this is the fairest possible system. Getting back to your original point in terms of, well, we had a solution 25 years ago, and now you want to change things. I am reminded when I first got elected by a very wise individual who held my seat years before I did, who said, "Be careful, Edward, for the solutions you seek, because there usually are the problems you will face in the future are usually the result of solutions that were put into place in the past." And that's what we're trying to do with here. We have created, in my mind, gross inequities as a result of what took place in 1982 and other particular bills. We're trying to address that. We will do that through the best method we can. We do that through a method that is, like I said, generally recognized by voters as the fairest possible method. And as we progress with this new method of dealing with assessments, we will probably from time to time have to tweak it further. I fully well have to expect that, because that's sort of an ongoing process.
Thank you.
I'm not trying to be a judge and jury here, but I think she asked you, did you have any data? Did you ever answer that question?
Well, in terms of the data, it's kind of hard. You know, it basically comes back to what do taxpayers believe to be the fairest process. That's the best data I can give you, and the answer to that is found in the scores of freezes that have been voted on by the voters around the state of Georgia, and enacted as a result of what took place in 1982, because the voters don't believe that the system that came up with in 1982 was fair. That's, I think, is the best data, that the voters don't believe that our solution was the fairest method, and have never sought to repeal those type of freezes. That was my point, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm sorry about order. I didn't keep up with who came on first, so I'm just going to kind of take them left to right. 19 is that Chairman Knight.
Thank you. Representative Lindsay, first of all, I want to thank you for this. This has been an issue that I know that this body has been looking at for the past couple of years, and I think in looking back at some of the arguments or some of the concepts here is making sure that it's fair to the taxpayers. In other words, and I like one of the ways that we described it in the past, which was making sure that if we do have taxes, it's through the front door, and our local citizens understand this process and have an ability to look at it at that local level and make sure that if there are taxes, that it's through the front door. Basically trying to go around and, I guess, plug in the back door or lock the back door so that everybody knows where to look. And while we have focused on this in the last couple of years, this complex issue, I believe we focused in on one side of it very heavily, and that's the valuation side. And I want to make sure everybody knows that this is not a property tax freeze, it's a valuation freeze is what it is. But as I look at it, and this is the question I want to pose to you, or thought to pose to you, is that the process of property taxes, it's an equation. It's the assessed value or the valuation that we're so focused on as a body right now on one side of the equation. My question is, and going back to my background as a CPA and audit, is going back to the budgetary process that our local governments and local school boards go through. And that's where they control a lot of that, and that's through the millage rate.
Yeah.
And I guess one of my concerns that as I looked through this and I've thought through this process is that we're focused so very much on valuation, of changing and sort of forcing down valuation, if we will. We've forgotten about that part of the equation, which is the millage rate. And it's a two-sided equation. We go back to our simple algebra, and you've got to control both sides before you can control the end result. And my question is, have we looked at this? In fact, in this bill, we talked about there's even a provision that for increasing or removing millage rate. So are we pushing down on one side so very much and making it detail, but we're not focusing on the millage rate part and perhaps the education that the citizens ultimately have the right to vote in or vote out those folks, and looking back at the budgetary process of our local county and city governments and how they do this?
Well, I don't think that we have any end-all, be-all. It's a matter of an ongoing process. But you did sort of touch on, I think, one of the most important aspects, and we've discussed this before, but I think it bears sort of presenting again. You talked about shutting the back door and making local governments go through the front door. What that simply does is it creates greater accountability and greater openness of government. One of the most disingenuous things I've heard from time to time around the state is when some official says, well, we haven't raised your millage rate. Matter of fact, we even lowered your millage rate while I was in office. Well, yeah, you lowered my millage rate, but you increased my assessments by 100%, and so my property taxes went up. It's disingenuous, and what this bill simply will require public officials to do is to look the voter in the eye and say, look, we have this particular project or particular governmental service, and we think it's important, and we think you think it's important, so that's why we think we're going to have to adjust upward or your millage rate. And then let the voter, sort of decide whether or not this individual is being a good steward of the money, rather than trying to hide behind reassessments in terms of gaining greater revenue for programs that the population may or may not want. What I found, even in my area of Atlanta, which is arguably, I don't think it's arguable, I think it's very clear we're the highest taxed area of the state. Even my area has voted for additional tax increases, where the local government has come forward to us and looked us in the eye and said we have to do it. And the most recent one being when we had to do it in order to fix our sewer system. Voters are smart. Voters are wise. Voters understand the need for services. They just want to be dealt with honestly. And I think one of the things with this is
I appreciate
that we trust
it. You and I agree on that, because you just touched on something that I've thought long and hard of. And what I do want to share the concerns, and that is that we're pushing so hard and making so much complicated on one side of the equation that it's very complicated, and we're forgetting the second part of the equation. And I want to ask you that if there's some other options out there that may help balance that equation, that the author and the majority whip would consider those that would help balance that equation a little bit. And I think go back to the heart of the issue, and that's at the local level where the budgetary process takes place, to make sure that it's more transparent to the taxpayers. Because I think you've touched on it. It's the front door that we need to go through, and not the back door. And I hope that I can talk to the author very shortly about some ideas.
And I agree with you. And we need to look at it in all aspects without sort of talking about it. For instance, we passed a bill that I authored 3 weeks ago that requires that all budgets and audits be placed on the internet so folks can see what's going on. That's the kind of openness we need to be, and transparency we need to be encouraging.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, we have a lot of questions remaining, and I want to take every one of those, and I want to vet every one of them. And I will promise each committee member, if they want to be heard on this matter, if you have an impressive soliloquy for us or whatever, we'll be glad to hear it, and I mean that in all sincerity. But try to keep your questions succinct and let him answer one before you get into a second or third. This stuff's complicated enough without having to try to figure out which one out of three to answer. So help me with that, okay, and be more succinct, and then I promise you every one of you can be heard on the matter.
And I'll try to be more succinct too, Mr. Chairman.
24 is that, Chairman? I know what yours is about. Let me come back to yours, Chairman Peake. No offense, but it's going to take a little while.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be real quick. Majority Whip Lindsey, thank you for this proposal. I know you've done a lot of hard work, put a lot of sweat into this, and we appreciate it. Let me just make sure it's real clear, just to us and anybody listening, that the voters, if I'm reading this right, the voters in the counties are going to decide whether they want this. Is that correct?
Yes.
Twice, in fact.
Yes.
We're going to have a statewide referendum to decide whether they want this or not. And then secondly, if that's passed, that each county will have the ultimate decision of whether they want to implement this in their county. Is that not correct?
Yes.
So, in effect, we're giving control back to the taxpayers through this legislation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Chairman Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it true that in Columbus Consolidated County Government, where they had this cap in place, there was a move to try to remove it at one point, in which it was defeated by 70-something% of the residents? So, in reference to data, hard data, I would offer that as pretty concrete hard data as somebody who has it in place. Citizens were asked, did they want to remove it? They overwhelmingly said no.
That is exactly my earlier point. I thank you for putting it much more bluntly than I did.
Chairman Rice, is that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a small technical question, Mr. Whip.
Yes, sir.
Again, I thank you for bringing this bill too. Again, it goes to the inflation percentage and the basis for calculating the actual opportunity for up to 3%.
Yes, sir.
I think it's found on lines 208 and 209. My question really resolves around a word that I'd overlooked and hadn't seen before. May mean nothing, but I'd like you to comment on it. And that is that it says in 208, the State Revenue Commissioner may use the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, published by da-da-da-da-da. What does urban mean? I guess I'm getting to the basis of how do I know in Gwinnett County what the inflation rate would be as opposed to Colquitt or Tiff or Atlanta or someplace like that?
Urban is a term of art used within the Department of Labor, and basically it's their CPI. It's the long definition of their CPI.
Does it coincide with the political subdivisions that we're talking about
Yes,
here in the bill?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is one for TIF,
Yeah.
and there is one for Gwinnett.
And what else? And in addition to that, it's important to point out that should our commissioner feel that there's something else that's more fair, that he has alternatives. He doesn't have to rely on that. That's simply one suggested method that he could use.
Thank you.
She could use.
Representative Abrams.
Thank you, and I apologize for making a statement, but just to put a finer point on Chairman Mills' comment, my point regarding data is that the 70% that voted in favor of it were the beneficiaries. The 30%, because I litigated this case, were the ones who actually had the slow growth properties who had the deleterious effect. And so, yes, indeed, the 70% did vote to keep it, and my concern is not that 70%. My concern is the 30%, which comprised 25% of the poverty, the impoverished, the lower to lower middle income people who live in Columbus, Muskogee, who actually had to bear the brunt of their increased economic burden. Those were the people who voted against it. And so I do think it's in the interest of fairness, having all information out there, that yes, you did have a 70% approval of retaining it, but you had that approval based on a group of people who were actually harmed by the tax break, by the tax freeze. And so with all due respect, I do think it's important to have the entire piece out there, that it wasn't simply that 70% liked it. You had 30% who didn't like it because they were the ones who faced the increased economic burden, and that's my concern.
I believe we'll have to look at, number one, I think in the end we live in a state in the country in which the majority rules. Number two, my analysis, where this has been voted in various areas, whether regardless of the socioeconomic community, it usually passes.
I'm not disagreeing with the passage rate at all. My point was
My point is that
let's let each other finish. In one question and one answer, please.
My question about data was not one of approval ratings of these bills. It's a question of the economic impact of the bills. And my concern was that what Chairman Mills stated went to the issue of approval of votes, not on economic impact, because the economic impact data is different than the voting data. The economic impact data shows that there is an economic effect to those in the lower socioeconomic brackets with slower appreciating properties. And I simply didn't want data to be floated out there as part of the conversation that wasn't empirically related. That was my only point. I do not disagree that, that these things pass and that indeed the majority of the populations will vote them into existence. My point is that the economic impact may be deleterious on those people who have the least amount of ability to manage it, and that we cannot correlate voting data with economic data. That was my only.
But I think what you can do is, and if you do look at it, I believe that you'll see that this is something that folks across the board believe to be, regardless of socioeconomic standing, will generally believe it to be more fair. One of the chief concerns that I have with this bill, for instance, with the present system, for instance, is that, for instance, and this gets back to faster growing areas, but nevertheless it's important, is that we literally in Atlanta have some folks who've lived in their homes from lower socioeconomic standing that are literally getting taxed out of their property because surrounding property is going up in value, and these people who've lived in their homes for 10, 20, 30 years suddenly can't afford to live in the communities that they have been. They've been literally taxed out. That's why this proposal is generally viewed upon favorably, even in among individuals from lower socioeconomic classes, Mr. Chairman.
I suspect that the two learned attorneys have been through these closing arguments before, and I certainly respect both viewpoints.
Yeah.
I hate to keep egging it on, but I just love watching it. Thank you all. I mean, that's what it's all about, is we're all learning a lot.
And it gets back to the issue of its balance of equities, and what do the voters think is fair.
Now I'm going to have to give her a close if you keep doing it.
No, I'll pass. I've already said that. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
We're interested in fairness here as well as this bill.
I know, Mr. Chairman.
Now, Representative Powell, I think, has some very productive suggestions for us, if you don't mind, Mr. Whip.
I look forward to him. He always does.
This is less philosophical and more technical.
Okay.
On line
Which one are we dealing with?
we're on the bill,
Okay.
and it's page 5, in subsection A of 485C6, starting
Yes, sir.
with line 136.
Yes, sir.
And dealing with the 1/7 phase-in of any triggering event is what this section deals with.
Yeah.
And recalling back to our last subcommittee meeting when we discovered that fair market value and assessed value are two different things, assessed value being 40% of fair market value. And if you'll look at line 137, it says any annual increase in the assessed value
Yes.
shall be the difference, 1/7 of the difference between the transferee's fair market value and the most recent value of that property established by the Board of Assessors. And since we're talking about increasing assessed value by the increase of the change in fair market value, I think what you're going to wind up is a distortion.
Okay.
For instance, like if the new value is 100,000, the old value was 30,000, you've got an increase of 70,000, 1/7 of that is 10. But you're increasing the assessed value by 10 based on the literal amount of this, and I'll ask the chairman to comment because he brought to the attention of everybody the
Yes.
distinction between fair market value and assessed value. And I'm asking you and the chairman on line 139, if we added the words right before difference, applicable percentage of fair market value pursuant to Code Section 48-5-7 multiplied by the, and then it would read, shall for tax purposes be limited to 1/7 of the applicable percentage of fair market value pursuant to Code Section 48-5-7 multiplied by the difference between the transferee's fair market value and the most recent value of that property. And I guess I would ask both of y'all to comment on that because I certainly don't want us to wind up with a distortion when we do the phase-in on the 1/7.
If you wish to go first,
I'm gonna let you go first, Mr. Chairman.
As a matter of fact, I've just dealt with it in 2 other bills we're going to do, so this is productive ground for us to talk about. I dealt with it differently, and I'm not sure that your methodology might be better or mine might be, but mine's certainly simpler. What I've used is the phrase most recently determined market value by the tax assessors. And that's an apple throughout the process. Not the assessed value, which we found is by code definition 40% of the market value as determined by the tax assessor's office, or otherwise in the code, like we have some 30% values, and in some other states have 100% values and so forth, which you've got some 100% values.
And I would defer to the chairman on that. All I wanted to do is make sure we're keeping the apples and the apples in the same crate.
What would the author consider the most recently determined market value by the tax assessor?
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you. And one thing I've learned on this committee is that it's important, to the extent possible, to reuse the same language over and over, so that we don't have folks down the road thinking, well, because they haven't used that same language they're using new language, that maybe they mean something different. So you're the expert on this in terms of the tax law. I think that we basically will end up in the same place, and your method will be more clear. So I would agree with you, Mr. Chairman.
I want to make sure the gentleman has no dispute at all with the concept that's attempted to be articulated. It's just
no, sir. I agree.
It needs to be less ambiguous than your opinion. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
We have a very, very good lawyer here that's young enough to not be near as one-dimensional as I, so I'm going to ask her advice on how we could best do this, and we'll stand at ease for a second while she can think through and write something for us here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me also, while she's doing that, if I'm allowed.
Because we're adding it on to 40%. So can I see your...
Mr. Chairman, while y'all do that, let me just very quickly say that while I thanked a lot of different people, I overlooked thanking 2 people that are probably the most important in terms of putting together a good bill. One would be obviously your legislative counsel, and the other one would be Ms. Napier. They both work very diligently to make sure that what we are trying to do gets articulated correctly, and I do appreciate it.
I think we'll move on. Hopefully it won't interrupt her thinking over here, and entertain that as an amendment if we get to that posture in the committee. Now, I don't see any other questions. Is there any member of the committee that wishes to be heard on the matters before them, actually the 2 matters, H.R. 1 and House Bill 5, whatever it is here, 517? Is that Chairman Williams?
Me, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to make a comment of the hard work that Representative Lindsay has done along with Yeoman's work. Excuse me. But it's been a hard task, and I know this is something that's been out there for a long time. And I think for one time that we're looking at the people that pay the bill, and I think we've come up with, crafted a bill that's fair to both sides, and there'll probably be some disagreement, but I want to commend you all for the hard work. The whole committee, I mean, we worked on this thing for a long time, so just want to give you my thanks for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your help.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the legislation? Any committee member? Pro or con? I don't see any, so what is the posture of the committee on H.R. 1? Now, you can't move and second. You got to do either one of them.
I didn't know if you was going to accept them or me, so at your discretion, I'll either make the motion or the second. Multitasking.
That's the resourcefulness of Oscilla. It sure is fascinating. I'll accept your motion, and I have from Chairman Roberts. I have a second from Chairman Williams. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion on HR 1, which is LC 188945S, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Okay, I think the ayes clearly have it, but I'll be glad to entertain a motion for a hand count if anybody doesn't agree with me. Okay, what's the posture of the committee on House Bill 517? I have a do pass motion on the committee substitute of House Bill 517, which is LC 189078S. I have a second from Chairman Roberts. I think the motion was Chairman Williams. Is there any further discussion on House Bill 517 or proposed amendments? Or proposed amendments?
Oh, is it time? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I make a motion at the beginning of line 139 before the word difference that the following words be added. Applicable percentage of fair market value pursuant to Code Section 48-5-7 multiplied by the.
Okay, I've got a question. Could you tell us what's in the code section that you just recited?
According to Ms. Lindsay, that's the 40%.
And that's what we're trying to do, is compare assessed values against assessed values so that we don't create any unnecessary ambiguity in here.
Yes, sir.
Okay, if you read it one more time for the committee.
Okay. Inserting before the word difference on line 139, applicable percentage of fair market value pursuant to Code Section 48-5-7 multiplied by the.
Okay, anybody besides me have any questions? 18, who was that? Chairman Knight? Oh, Mr. Glenn?
Sure.
Okay. If the references to the 40, well, I'll tell you what, that code section actually says that the assessed value is 40% unless otherwise in the code, which we have some 30% and some hundreds we talked about. Is everybody satisfied legally we've covered all those eventualities and we're comparing apples against apples? I just got a whole bunch of new knowledge that flooded into my head that most of the special assessments are already included in the bill, so that would be excluded from the bill, so that would be the case. Okay, we have an amendment before us. What's the posture of the committee on the amendment? You move, I assume.
Yes, sir.
Is there objection? Is there objection to the amendment? Hearing no objection, the amendment's in. So now we have House Bill substitute to House Committee sub to House Bill 517 as amended before the committee. What's the pleasure of the committee? I have a motion due pass by Chairman Roberts. Do I have a second? Second by Chairman Mills. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. I think the ayes have it, but I will entertain a motion for a hand count for those on the nay side if they don't agree with my hearing ability. That's seeing none. The matter passes, and we will submit it to the Rules Committee. Thank you, Representative Lindsay, for
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
a very good presentation.
Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
And now we're in for just an incredibly special treat. We're going to get to hear, and the chair recognizes the distinguished chairman of the Transportation Committee, the gentleman from Osceola, Chairman Roberts, to tell us about House Bill 1186. Please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's always a pleasure to present before this committee. And House Bill 1186 is a piece of legislation that was brought to us, or is being brought to us by the department. Most of you know that over the last several weeks and months, we've been working on putting P3s together for the department, which is public-private partnerships. What this language simply does is allow and in the event that a public-private partnership is developed, that there would not be any ad valorem taxes charged to that private entity, with the feeling that if the department 100% owned that land or built that road, that there would not be any ad valorem taxes charged. This is just another tool to be able to encourage those public-private partnerships here in the state of Georgia so that we can move forward as far as building road projects throughout the state. I'll be glad to answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Good. We have one. Chairman Knight.
Just, and I know we talked about this at subcommittee, Chairman Roberts, this is roads and bridges.
Roads and bridges.
This is not property or real property in the sense of
Correct.
buildings or structures.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Representative Black.
Are all of these projects to be state projects, or is there provisions in the code that will let the counties have a public-private partnership?
This is concerning state projects.
There's no provisions right now for the counties?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you.
That's interesting, no, but this is really not about providing for the partnerships. This is just providing the ad valorem tax relief for the private enterprise that participates in the partnerships. This is really not a provision for it. We already have law that allows this.
That's correct. We have. And we've passed the rules and regs that are currently in place for public-private partnerships. We had a 3.5-hour meeting one day in our Transportation Committee on those rules and regs. So, yes, sir.
And I was also thinking we have law that provides for intergovernmental agreements, Representative Black, which might very well be an affirmative answer to your question, as the counties could do it or not. This would just assure, if they were able to enter into an intergovernmental agreement for a transportation project, that they would have the same ad valorem tax treatment throughout the whole geographic boundaries of the state.
My mind was just wandering off on one of these weird tracks when you said
that never happens to me.
It was going to encourage these type partnerships, and it occurred to me that if the counties were doing it, and they had the option of taxing it for ad valorem, then it would increase the cost of doing it, but it would also provide them an additional source of revenue, and the enticement of an additional source of revenue might be a more of an encouragement to get these type, rather than them doing it themselves. So, I mean, that would just,
I think
like
that's the whole idea behind the limit, behind the public-private partnership.
Since the counties can't get involved in it, it's a moot point.
Right. Chairman Roberts, this legislation comes to us from our Georgia Department of Transportation, doesn't it? I mean, it's something correct. They've asked us to do.
In fact, I think they've already sent out the first RFQ.
RFQ. RFQ. Okay. Any other questions to the author? Anybody on the committee wish to be heard on the matter? Seeing none, what's the posture of the committee? I have a do pass motion by Chairman Peake and a second by Representative Powell, I think it was. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion do pass on House Bill, what is it? 1186, committee sub, I think it is. Signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries unanimously, and we'll have this in rules. Would Chairman Knight, would you agree to take over the chair?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll recognize you, and it's your choice. You have two bills, HB 1191 and HB 1192, if you'll take them by your order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The HB 1191 deals with what we know as intangible tax and the allocation of intangible tax as it would relate to a multiple county transaction. What intangible tax is in our code is a tax that is assessed against a mortgage. A mortgage is a generic term for really what is a deed to secure debt, which is the way we grant collateral to a lender. The tax is based on a finite $1.50 per $500 worth of a mortgage, so it's predicated upon the mortgage amount and a factor multiplied, sort of like millage times appraised value in a sense. The dilemma in the law for heretofore has been if the property that's going to be collateral, that's encumbered by a lender for collateral purposes, is situate in more than one county or more than one state, we've had no methodology in the code for how to allocate that tax. And what this bill simply does is you take the value in each situs, each county, or could be another state actually, against the overall value upon which the intangible tax was derived, and apportion it accordingly. And it sets up the methodology where the lender or the closer or the individual taxpayer can send in either an affidavit that he's gotten those values from the tax assessor's office, or actually send in the records from the tax assessor's office to establish the ratio. But it just takes what has been a sort of a complete ambiguity out of the code in years before now as to how that's to be assessed. Heretofore, what's been happening is the taxpayer, the closer, lender has been sending the intangible tax and the security deed to one county and waiting on them to record it. Then it's incumbent upon the receiving county to do the distribution, and we've given them no methodology to do that. This does that on the fairest way we can think of, which is a ratio between the actual county's determinations of value. With that, I'll yield to any questions.
Any questions from the members? Mr. Chairman, I think you did a eloquent job of explaining that.
25, I have a question.
No, you didn't turn it off before.
Okay.
All
All right. And if you don't,
yeah, go ahead, Mr. Chairman. I think
if you don't mind, before we take action on that, if I could move to 1192, it's the exact same explanation except with another tax, which is known as the transfer tax, the real estate transfer tax. And that is based on $1 per thousand of the unencumbered consideration paid for real property. And again, if that real property is located in more than one county or more than one state, this is the first time to my knowledge that we've had codified apportionment formula to deal with that for our local governments. And with that being said, I'll be glad to answer any questions on that, but I also need to be recognized for an amendment of my own legislation.
All right.
If there happens to be a due pass recommendation made.
Well, any comments or questions from members? All right, well, then we will, what is the will of committee? We will go take up HB 1191. Do we have, what's the will of the committee? We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor, please say aye. All those, or is this the
amendment?
to 1191?
To both.
I'm sorry. Let's.
I meant to say I have discussion.
All right, my apologies. I thought the amendment was on 92. Before we take that vote, we've got some discussion. We'll recognize the chairman for an amendment.
The issue in the amendment is that we would be fine using assessed value in Georgia as it relates to county because that's a legal defined term in our code. We have come to learn from some folks that have been very helpful to us that our adjoining states, at least one of which we're aware of, North Carolina, does not use an assessed value. They use an 100% value method like Chairman Williams was talking about. So we really need to be talking about the most recently determined market value, which is a defined term in our code as well, by the tax assessor. So my amendment proposal on House Bill 1191 is, if you would read that, Ms. Napier.
I think if we amend on line 22 and have it read, such proportions shall be calculated pursuant to the most recently determined fair market valuations of the property as determined by the County Board of Tax Assessors.
Okay. Does everybody understand the amendment? Oh, you're the chairman.
Chairman Powell.
Just one question, and I understand the purpose of the amendment and how it works. If we're dealing with a situation where North Carolina is involved, would it present a problem if they don't determine by a county board of taxes? I mean, we're assuming that we're using Georgia terminology, and I'm just wondering if maybe or comparable, and I'm just asking the question for the chairman.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. The or comparable language in any contiguous state. I think if we'll add that, I'd be happy to add that to my amendment. In case they don't call it a tax assessor's board, that's a very good thought.
Thanks, sir.
So now, Ms. Napier, could I get you to read it as the amendment as amended?
Okay, starting on line 21. Such proportions shall be calculated pursuant to the most recently determined fair market valuations of the property as determined by the County Board of Tax Assessors or comparable assessing entity.
In any contiguous state.
In any contiguous state.
I don't think we want a comparable entity in Georgia, but in any contiguous state. Representative Abrams, you looked at me. I'm happy to hear what you have to say. We're just trying to make this better and work.
I just wonder about the necessity of any contiguous state, because although I just think, given that this it's a fairly specific rule, I'm just concerned as a legal matter of adding that additional language. We don't know what may come up, but there's no. I don't understand the necessity. It seems like boots and belt and suspenders and a tie clip. I don't see the need for the additional language, because even though it's unlikely, the possibility means that you'd have to go back in and change it just because you have an unlikely situation. So just as a legal matter, I don't know that we need any contiguous state, since what we're trying to declare is that anytime we deal with this issue, you can look to the governing body of that entity for the purpose, which is a very complicated way of saying I don't think we need extra language.
It's a question, not an argument. But what I want to make sure of, though, is I want that body defined in Georgia to be the tax assessor's office. That's the preeminent body. I'm not sure there's any other governmental body that has that authority in Georgia, but I wouldn't want to. What I'm worried about is what they might call these governmental bodies in contiguous states, because that's what I'm getting at, is a transaction either
right.
conveyance or mortgage transaction interstate.
And I guess because I just don't know the history, would this only impact contiguous states with Georgia under all circumstances?
Unless somebody owned a strip of property that went from Georgia all the way through a contiguous state to another state, and I don't think that example exists anywhere, but typically it would only, not only, I mean, most of it's going to be county to county.
Right.
There are going to be many, like farms in Valdosta go across the Florida line all the time. Right. And we don't know how to apportion intangible tax and transfer taxes where you have, the deeds are very similar when they're recorded. That's what we're trying. That's the
Mr. Powell has a sort of similar
Representative Powell.
quizzical look.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though, but there is the possibility that you've got a piece of property that is one piece of property, but I thought this also applied if I'm giving additional collateral
right.
for a loan, and so I've got a tract in Alabama, and I've got a tract in Florida, and I've got a tract in Mississippi that I'm giving as additional collateral, or one in Mitchell County, one in Dougherty County, and one someplace else. So I didn't know that they had to be one
contiguous
one parcel of land. I thought we were dealing with what could be several tracts of land located in different places.
I think we are, in the sense that the language in the style paragraph is within and outside the state, so that would contemplate other states. And I guess there is a circumstance where you could give some land in Mississippi, which is not contiguous, so I suppose that's it. The clerks don't care about that. They just care about in Georgia. Right. That's what they've told me, but we got to solve that problem to make a good law.
Could we say in any affected state, so that, to your point about not having just but my concern about contiguous is that that's just too narrowly defined.
I agree with you now, especially. So affected state. So could you read it again, Ms. Napier?
Sure. Starting on line 21 again. Such proportions shall be calculated pursuant to the most recently determined fair market valuations of the property as determined by the County Board of Tax Assessors or comparable assessing entity in any affected state.
Wow.
Thank y'all. All right. Chairman has proposed amendment as read by Ms. Napier. What is it? Will of the body, we have a first and a second. All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, same sign. All right, the amendment. I'm sorry, we got one more. All right. We got a new. All right, we're going to entertain a amendment.
Mr. Chairman, if I'd be recognized for one more amendment. There's a typographical error on line 2. The very last word of line 2 should be than instead of that.
Okay. Everybody have that?
I propose that as an amendment.
All right. Will of the body, we have first and a second. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? All right. That's the second amendment to 1191. Now that we have the amendments, Mr. Chairman, is there any more amendments on 1191? All right. Now we've got all the amendments made. What is the will of the body on House Bill 1191 as amended? And we have those two amendments that we just voted on. What is the will of the body? All right. And we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, like sign. All right. We have a due pass on 1191 as amended. Now, Mr. Chairman, several amendments, or possibly some amendments on 1192.
Yes, members of the committee, 1192 is very, very similar, but not identical to 1191, but it deals with the real estate transfer tax. And there's no interstate contemplation because every state clearly has its own transfer tax provisions around us that won't be Well, they will be, though. What do you see as the amendment? This one. All right. Would you read our proposed amendment?
Sure. This similarly will be with the sentence beginning with such proportions on line 23. And we'll read, such proportions shall be calculated pursuant to the most recently determined fair market valuations of the property as determined by the County Board of Tax Assessors. And I don't see that this is even in different states with the same issue.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll read that one more time. This one will just read, such proportions shall be calculated pursuant to the most recently determined fair market valuations of the property as determined by the County Board of Tax Assessors, period.
Any other amendments on this one, Mr. Chairman?
Not that I'm aware of at this point in time, but I'm curious as to why we don't contemplate interstate. This pretty much would have to be a separate deed transaction. Would necessarily have to specify a separate consideration if it were interstate. That's probably why we don't contemplate other states in this.
I know we had some learned attorneys, Powell and Representative Abrams.
Do you have something to add?
No, I agree with you.
Okay. So we actually don't need that language in here for conveyance purposes.
Right.
So that's it. That's all the amendments I propose.
All right. We have a motion and a second on the amendment as read by Ms. Napier on House Bill 1192. All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed? All right. We have the amendment as passed. Now we'll take the House Bill 1192 as amended. What's the will of the committee? We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? All those opposed, like sign. All right. House Bill 1192 passes as amended. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Knight. That's all we have on our agenda today, ladies and gentlemen. Does any member of the committee have anything they want to address the committee about before adjournment? I don't see anybody, but I sure do want to thank every member of the committee for your hard work as usual, and we stand adjourned.